Will come to order. Ms. Ramirez, for what purpose do you seek recognition again?
Mr. Chair, pursuant to Clause 1A of Rule 11, I move that the committee do not recess until 1:30 p.m., and I do have a motion at the desk for that.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's recognized.
I move to table.
Motion's made to table this motion from Ms. Ramirez.
Mr. Chair, I request a recorded vote.
Yeah. All those in favor of tabling the motions will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. And the motion to table.
I do request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall. Aye. Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Aye. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Aye. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop.
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez.
Aye.
Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Pfluger.
Aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Aye. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green.
Aye.
Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Lalota. Aye. Mr. Lalota votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. D'Esposito. Aye. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee. Aye. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell. Aye. Mr. Luttrell votes aye. Mr. Strong.
Aye.
Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen. Aye. Mr. Burkeen votes aye. Mr. Crane. Aye. Mr. Crane votes aye. Ranking Member Thompson.
No.
Ranking Member Thompson votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Payne.
No.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Correa.
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter. No. Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar.
No.
Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner.
No.
Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy.
No.
Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman.
Nay.
Mr. Goldman votes no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes no. Mrs. Ramirez.
No.
Mrs. Ramirez votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no.
How's the chair recorded?
Chair is not recorded.
Chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Correa?
Unanimous consent?
Let's get the vote done on this motion to table, and then I'll recognize you for that purpose or whatever purpose. Clerk, please report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 16 ayes and 14 noes.
So the motion is tabled, and I recognize for what purpose, Mr. Correa?
Unanimous consent to insert the record an article?
Can you tell us what it is?
Washington Post dated today entitled House Republicans Keep Fumbling in Immigration. Unfortunately, these articles complain about measures taken by a completely different agency, the State Department, which Mayorkas does not control.
Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, the gentlelady from Texas, for 5 minutes on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I started this morning by describing this impeachment proceedings as revengeful impeachment, simply to get back at a performing member of the public sector who is directed by his boss, the President of the United States, to follow laws and policies. I say this to the American people because we pretend that our work here today and every day we come to this Congress, having taken an oath, is for the American people. There is no doubt that on this side of the aisle, there is a committed and dedicated concern to the idea of sex trafficking, abhorrent, human trafficking, abhorrent, any form of drug trafficking, terrorism. There is no doubt that every member that I know on the Democratic side of the aisle has been engaged vigorously in fighting against these terroristic acts. Each and every one of them is a terroristic act to be trafficked, to be subjected to drug trafficking. All of these require the work together for the American people. Today, we are being fooled that work is being done against an individual for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The American people understand that that is not the actions that we are here for today. Revenge, vengefulness is why we're here. Otherwise, they would understand that Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas is an individual whose family fled the Nazis and then Cuba before arriving here in the United States. That is what he went through. He is the first immigrant to serve as head of the Department of Homeland Security. And yet, this committee seeks to suggest that he is violating the Constitution when, in essence, his freedom is based upon our Constitution. He did block the unlawful act of separating parents from children under the Trump administration. Maybe that's why he's being attacked. He did act as a federal prosecutor, not as, in quotes, a liberal activist, to be able to recognize that we should treat immigrants with dignity. He did act to be able to secure our ports and borders and enforce immigration laws, and he did act to fight for comprehensive immigration reform. But yet, we have two articles, one suggesting that he has willfully violated the law, and clearly, on the very case of Texas versus the United States in 2022, this was a court and policy decision. And coming from Texas, one of the few on this committee, going to the border more times than I can imagine, we have an actual standoff right now at the border between the federal government and one single state acting against the authority of the federal government, violating the law. And our secretary is being impeached, allegedly, for willfully violating the law that doesn't exist. That particular case indicated initially that the states in question, Texas and Louisiana, did not have standing. This is not a willful violation of the law when you have a secretary trying to step in to find space to do his job. The breach of public trust? Where is the willful or habitual neglect or refusal to perform the duties of the office? Give him a law. Give him the Senate bill discussed, compromised, and voted on. Give him comprehensive immigration reform, and there will be a law to discuss. There is none. This is a MAGA pathway of vengefulness, of repeating what a presidential candidate is asking you to do. To the American people, this is not what you're asking us to do. You're asking us to have an administration that works. And so the secretary has said this administration has removed and returned or expelled more migrants in 3 years than the prior administration in 4 years. Since May 12, 2023, DHS has removed or returned more than 500,000 individuals, the vast majority of whom crossed the southwest border. Total removals and returns since May 2023 exceed removals and returns in every full fiscal year since 2015. Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has
Mr.
expired.
Chairman, let me conclude by simply saying.
Chairman.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I made it very
no
clear at the
basis
beginning that
on
we were
these
going to stick to the
articles,
5
Mr. Chairman,
minutes.
I'd like to
So the gentlelady is not recognized. I now recognize Mr. Guest for
Mr. Chairman,
for what purpose? You seek recognition?
ask unanimous consent.
For what?
Mr. Chair, ask unanimous consent to include in the record a letter from the Republican Attorney Generals, including the 3 who testified before our committee this month, which endorses Texas blocking Border Patrol access to portions of the border in violation of federal law. This letter demonstrates these attorney generals lack a commitment to following the Constitution.
Without objection, so ordered. I recognize Mr. Guest for 5 minutes to comment on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I wanted to be clear here today that this is not political theater. That what is happening today is we are attempting to rein in a rogue cabinet secretary. A cabinet secretary that has failed to enforce the law. If you don't believe that, just look at the statistics put out by his department. In the last 6 months, Mr. Chairman, we have seen 1.9 million encounters across the entire northern and southern border. Last month alone, 371,000. And in addition to that, Mr. Chairman, we are not talking about the fact that this secretary has breached the public trust. Just last hearing that we had on this, we saw the Democrats called in a congressional expert who said you don't have to have high crimes and misdemeanors. Their own expert in constitutional law says that a cabinet secretary could be breached or could be impeached for a breach of public trust. And I will tell you that that is exactly what we have with Secretary Mayorkas. That he has lied repeatedly to members of this committee. I can count times in which he has lied to questions that I have asked Secretary Mayorkas. Where he's lied to questions where Chairman Green has asked him about the border being secured. Questions by Dan Bishop, August Pfluger, Ms. Jackson Lee, former member of this committee, Kat Kamak. I can document at least 6 times where he has repeatedly lied when asked, is the border secure? I'll look at headlines and pulled a few this morning regarding Secretary Mayorkas.
Gentleman, you for a question?
I will not. Mayorkas tells Congress the southern border is secure. DHS Chief Mayorkas said there is no border crisis. Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas tells lawmakers the border is not open. Mayorkas says the border is closed, defends Biden's immigration strategy. Mayorkas takes heat for repeating border is secure during House hearings. They go on to say this is nonsense. DHS Chief Alejandro Mayorkas' secure border claim a lie, CBP official says. Mayorkas accused of lying under oath, playing shell game with data by former border official. And my favorite, Mr. Chairman, Mayorkas' latest litanies of lies on the border put Santos to shame. These are the headlines. And these are what are being talked about because Secretary Mayorkas has been untruthful with the American public and he has been untruthful for Congress. He comes in here and he raises his hand and he swears to tell the truth. And then he lies when he says the border's secure. He lies when he says that the border is not open and we are not allowing, as we know, over 370,000 immigrants to flood across the border last month alone. I want to talk about what House Republicans have done. Because my friends on the other side say that we are doing this again for political theater. Last year we passed H.R. 2, the most comprehensive package that I have seen during my time in Congress. When we talk about funding and what have we done on funding, I'll tell you that the House Appropriations Bill dealing with funding for the Department of Homeland Security, we went above and beyond what was requested by the President. The President requested a set amount and we added additional money to that so that the Department of Homeland Security would have the resources that they need to secure the border. And then when we talk about the Senate bill, I have no idea what's in the Senate bill. I tell you, I am disappointed that our senators refuse to engage the House of Representatives. They don't allow Chairman Green or Ranking Member Thompson a seat at the table. We don't know what's in that bill. I can't speak of whether I'll support the bill or not. We've seen that. I will not yell, and I have 30 seconds, and I will finish my time. I will tell you that for the Democrats to accuse Republicans of political theater is wrong. I want to end with this. I want to end with the fact that there was a recent letter. A letter actually was dated in 2021 by former official Rodney Scott. Rodney was chief of Border Patrol under both Trump and Biden. That letter described how he witnessed a seismic shift in border security and immigration policy that began on January 20, 2021. And that began with a lack of a meaningful effort to secure the border. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would like unanimous consent to enter that letter into the record, and I would yield back.
Without
Mr. Chairman.
objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent.
What
motion.
purpose do you, unanimous consent?
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a news article from December 6, 2023 on why my colleague, Representative Mike Ezell, voted to keep known liar and former Representative George Santos in Congress because, quote, my personal feelings about him do not meet the standards our founding fathers established for expulsion, end quote.
I would object to unanimous consent. I don't think that that's relevant in this hearing.
You just brought up Mr. Santos's
Hold on, we're not discussing it.
lies.
A motion's been made for unanimous consent. There's an objection.
So ask for the roll.
You ought to get used to opening the door.
I quoted a headline, sir. I did not open the door to vote.
No one's recognized right now but the chair. Nobody's recognized but the chair. All right. So it is not entered with the objection. So I
Ask
now
for a
recognize-
recorded vote.
So is the gentleman making a motion?
I had a unanimous consent motion.
Right, that was
Objected to.
objected
So now
to.
I move for the inclusion of this article and showing that Republican members of this committee apply constitutional standards very selectively.
So all those in favor of admitting to the record the article presented by Mr. Goldman of New York and say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the article is not admitted.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall. No. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Guest. No. Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Jimenez.
No.
Mr. Jimenez votes no. Mr. Pfluger.
No.
Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mr. Garbarino. No. Mr. Garbarino votes no. Ms. Green.
No.
Ms. Green votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. LaLota. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell? No. Mr. Luttrell votes no. Apologies. Mr. Strong?
No.
Mr. Strong votes no. Mr. Burkeen? Mr. Crane? Mr. Crane votes no. Ranking Member Thompson?
Aye.
Ranking Member Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Payne? Aye. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Correa?
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Mr. Carter?
Aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Tanadar?
Aye.
Mr. Tanadar votes aye. Mr. Magaziner?
Aye.
Mr. Magaziner votes aye. Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Goldman?
Aye.
Mr. Goldman votes aye. Mr. Garcia? Aye. Mr. Garcia votes aye. Mrs. Ramirez? Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes aye.
How's Mr. LaLota recorded?
Mr. LaLota is not recorded. Mr. LaLota votes no.
How's the chair recorded?
Chair is not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Chairman Green votes no.
Clerk will, how's Ms. Garcia, or Ms. Ramirez?
Ramirez.
Ramirez.
I vote yes.
Mr.
She
Ramirez
votes yes.
votes aye.
Anyone else? The clerk will report to tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, there were 15 ayes and 14 noes.
The ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Wait. The noes have it. Wait, say that again. Clerk, could you report that again?
Apologies. It is 15 noes to 14 ayes.
Okay. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I would move to strike Mr. Guest's comments about George Santos, given that the majority has now prevented entering into the record a document related to George Santos.
The request is not timely.
Well, it's timely now because you only rejected it right now.
It's not timely. The gentleman's not recognized. I now recognize Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes of his comments on the
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
amendment.
Chairman.
When I first came to Congress, Mr. Chairman, I had the great honor of befriending the gentleman from Alaska, the Dean of the House, Don Young. I had the privilege of sitting next to Don for 5 years before his death. Don told me when I first came to Congress, he said, Clay, if you want to understand this body, you have to understand a simple fact. He said the Republican Party is primarily a party of businessmen. The Democrat Party is primarily a party of attorneys. That's being shown quite clearly today. So let this old street cop give some of our fancy attorneys on the other side of the aisle a little history lesson. When it was first proposed to limit impeachments in the American Constitution to treason and bribery alone, Virginia Delegate George Mason pointed out that Hastings, who was being impeached at the time by Parliament, is not guilty of treason. Mason questioned the wisdom of limiting impeachment to those two offenses, arguing that treason is defined in the Constitution, as defined in the Constitution, would not reach many great and dangerous offenses that attempts to subvert the Constitution may not be treason as defined, and that it's the more necessary to extend the power of impeachments. Mason then moved that the convention add maladministration to the impeachment power. Eldridge Gerry seconded the motion. Then James Madison argued that the term maladministration, which deviated from the more commonly recognized phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, was so vague a term that it would be the equivalent to a tenure during pleasure of the Senate. Quote of Madison. Governor Morris agreed with Madison, at which point Mason withdrew his motion and substituted as grounds for impeachment, quote, bribery and high crimes and misdemeanors. Bribery and other high crimes and misdemeanors. The motion carried without any further discussion of the new phrase, which ultimately became part of the Constitution. Here's the bottom line. As historians summarize, the actions of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention stated that, in summary, through the early debates, every speaker referred to neglect of duty and misconduct in office as impeachable offenses. And after Madison objected to the vagueness of the proposed impeachment clause, Mason then moved to add high crimes and misdemeanors. This passed 8-3 and became the orthodox phraseology. The vote in favor of the compromise motion suggests that the delegates understood that the new terms included neglect of duty. The addition of misdemeanors to the list of offenses meant that the House of Representatives was permitted to charge officials with misuse of power and neglect of duty. As has been quoted by many scholars, specifically, the term misdemeanors in its original meaning carried with it less the sense of a smaller or less serious criminal law offense, which would be today's common usage of the word, and more the broader sense of misconduct or misbehavior, literally of not demeaning oneself properly, misdemeaning in the exercise of an official capacity or position. The breadth of the constitutional language employed as a standard for impeachment thus plainly embraces a range of congressional judgment extending beyond bare criminality as to what types of culpable official misconduct so amount to a betrayal of trust, responsibility, duty, or integrity as to warrant removal from office. And that's where we are today.
Will the gentleman...
My colleagues, no, I will not. You didn't yield to me, my brother.
I don't
My colleagues across the aisle seem to say that it's acceptable that we've had 10 million illegal crossings in 3 years, that we've had pushing 300,000 Americans dead from opioid overdose. We're losing our country down there. And the man responsible for executing that policy is Alejandro Mayorkas. He will be impeached through this committee this day. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose do you seek recognition?
I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the actual notes from the Constitutional Convention on that exact point in which the framers rejected the maladministration, malpractice, and neglect of duty.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman?
And if I might, this is edited by Max Farrand, the records of the Federal Convention of 1787.
We just need the title on those. Mr. Magaziner, for what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter an article to the record in which frequent Republican impeachment witness Professor Jonathan Turley states there's no basis for impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. The article is titled Homeland Security Chief Alejandro Mayorkas' failures are not impeachable, and it appeared in the Daily Beast.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
I also ask unanimous consent.
So ordered.
I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record an excerpt from the book Impeachment by constitutional law professor Raoul Berger and the founder of the constitutional originalism that inspired Supreme Court Justice Scalia, explaining that the term high crimes and misdemeanors is a limited phrase that does not reach policy disagreements and was not intended to use for purposes like we have today.
Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered. Ms. Green.
I ask unanimous consent to enter from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on April 30th, 2021. DHS announces steps to protect border communities from wall construction.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Chair. Mr. Thanadar. What purpose?
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an op-ed published this morning by Norman Eisen, former impeachment counsel for the House Judiciary Committee and others, in which they point out that House Republicans have spent months searching unsuccessfully for a smoking gun in the Joe Biden impeachment investigations. Instead of admitting failure, they are now pivoting to another target in their frenzy to impeach anyone, no matter how baselessly, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Green, for what purpose?
I ask unanimous consent to enter a Homeland Security tweet on October 8th, 2021, consistent with the DHS border barrier plan at CBP in coordination with the USA CEHQ intends to cancel the remaining border barrier contracts located within the Laredo sector and all border barrier contracts located in the Rio Grande Valley sector.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent.
Mr. Goldman.
I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a section of the book by esteemed constitutional lawyers Lawrence Tribe and Joshua Matz explaining to Mr. Higgins' point, quote, when the framers replaced maladministration with high crimes and misdemeanors, they sought to narrow, not expand, the class of impeachment offenses, and high crimes and misdemeanors was understood as limited to serious misconduct that inflicted injury on the state itself. Mason and Madison thus rejected a term that allowed impeachment for strong differences over policy and personnel.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I have one more.
For what purpose?
From the same authors, another excerpt where they explain that key elements of high crimes and misdemeanors like treason and bribery involve corruption, betrayal, or an abuse of power that subverts core tenets of the U.S. governmental system, proof of intentional evil deeds that risk grave injury to the nation, and they're plainly wrong that the current standards that no reasonable official...
Just the title, Mr. Goldman's all we need. Is that the title?
You don't like the explanation?
No, please
Mr.
read.
Chairman?
But we're talking about saving some time here. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Are you done with the title?
It is from constitutional law scholars Lawrence Tribe of Harvard and Joshua Matt.
Without objection, so ordered.
Chairman,
Mr.
Mr.
Menendez,
Chair.
you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask unanimous consent to include in the record testimony from constitutional law expert Frank Bowman before this committee, explaining that Republicans have not alleged any constitutionally impeachable offenses against Secretary Mayorkas and swatting down the Republicans' allegations as unimpeachable policy differences.
Without objection, so ordered. And what we're going to do now is take a 30-minute recess for lunch. We're going to let everybody just take a break, go eat some lunch. We're going to be here a while today, it seems. So we're going to do this in as friendly a manner as possible. So we'll reconvene at 12:35.